The phone call came at 11:45 a.m. on January 31st, 1943. In the map room of the Wolf's Lair, the air was so thick with tension you could almost taste the fear. General Jodel's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the receiver. Everyone in the room knew what this call meant. For the past 48 hours, the radio transmissions from Stalingrad had gone from desperate to silent. The final message from General Powers had been heartbreaking. "We have no ammunition, no food, thousands of wounded without medical care. The end is inevitable." When Jodl hung up, he didn't need to speak. His ashen face told the entire story. He walked slowly toward Hitler, who was leaning over a large map of the Eastern Front, moving colored pins that represented divisions that no longer existed. "Mein Führer," Jodl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Powerless has surrendered. The Sixth Army is no more." What happened next was documented by multiple witnesses, and would become one of the most psychologically revealing moments of the war. Hitler didn't scream, he didn't throw his famous temper tantrum. Instead, something far more terrifying occurred. He completely deflated. The pointer he'd been using to trace imaginary battle lines clattered to the floor. He sank into his chair like a marionette whose strings had been cut. For 3 full minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the large oak clock in the corner. Then, in a voice so quiet everyone had to lean forward to hear, he whispered he could have ended it with one bullet. One bullet and eternal glory. Instead, this cowardice, this moment right here, was when the myth of Nazi invincibility didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Not on the frozen streets of Stalingrad, but in this comfortable wood-paneled room in East Prussia. The man who had promised 1,000-year Reich had just received undeniable proof that his grand vision was collapsing. To truly understand why this moment hit Hitler like a physical blow, we need to rewind 6 months to the summer of 1942. That was the absolute peak of Nazi power. In North Africa, Rommel was pushing the British back toward Egypt. In the Caucasus, German troops were approaching the oil fields that could fuel their war machine for years. And in Stalingrad, the Sixth Army was methodically crushing Soviet resistance block by block. Hitler's intuition seemed supernatural. He had outmaneuvered professional generals, predicted enemy movements, and built an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga. Then came Operation Uranus in November 1942, a masterpiece of Soviet planning that Hitler completely failed to anticipate. In a perfectly executed pincer movement, the Soviets surrounded the entire Sixth Army. Nearly 300,000 of Germany's best soldiers, the men who had conquered France, who had marched thousands of miles into Russia, were suddenly trapped in what soldiers would later call the Kessel cauldron. Hitler's response to the encirclement reveals everything about his deteriorating strategic mind. Every one of his field commanders recommended an immediate breakout. Even the usually loyal General von Manstein begged for permission to rescue the Sixth Army, but Hitler refused. "I won't go back from the Volga," he screamed during one conference. "We have invested too much in this city. The name alone makes it crucial." Instead of military logic, he embraced fantasy. Hermann Göring, always eager to please, promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the entire Sixth Army by air. Never mind that this would require 700 tons of supplies daily, an impossible task given the weather, the distance, and Soviet air superiority. Never mind that experienced Luftwaffe commanders calculated they could deliver maybe 100 tons on a good day. Hitler chose to believe the fantasy. The reality inside the Stalingrad pocket was medieval in its horror. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees C. Soldiers' boots fell apart in the cold. Rifles jammed because the lubricating oil froze. Men were reduced to burning their own dead comrades for warmth. The daily ration shrank to a single slice of bread and maybe some horsemeat soup. Meanwhile, the promised airlift delivered less than 20% of what was needed. Planes that managed to break through Soviet defenses often carried useless cargo. Cases of condoms and bottles of champagne instead of ammunition and medical supplies. Through all this, Hitler maintained an almost religious belief in Pauwels' obedience. On January 30th, 1943, he promoted Pauwels to Field Marshal. The message was unmistakable. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The expectation was clear: shoot yourself, become a martyr for the cause. When Pauwels instead chose captivity, it wasn't just military disobedience. It was the complete rejection of Hitler's entire value system. The cult of death had been refused, and the refusal came from one of his most loyal commanders. The aftermath in the Wolf's Lair was meticulously documented by staff members who would survive the war. Hitler retreated to his private quarters and didn't emerge for 36 hours. His personal valet, Heinz Linger, later recalled hearing constant pacing and muttering through the door. When aides tried to bring food, they were turned away with curses. When he finally emerged, he was a changed man, paranoid, bitter, his eyes burning with a new kind of fury. He immediately ordered 3 days of national mourning. But everyone close to him understood this was about more than lost soldiers. This was about broken faith. Strategically, Hitler was intelligent enough to grasp what Stalingrad meant. Germany had lost an entire army, its best army. The Eastern Front would never recover the initiative. The casualty figures were staggering. Nearly 150,000 Germans dead in the fighting. Another 91,000 marched into Soviet captivity, where most would die. But psychologically, something even more fundamental had broken. The clear-throat man who believed pure willpower could overcome any obstacle had just seen his will defied by one of his own generals. From this day forward, every military decision would be filtered through this new lens of betrayal and suspicion. The confident, charismatic leader who had mesmerized crowds of thousands was gone. In his place emerged the paranoid tyrant who would micromanage his armies to destruction, who trusted no one, and who increasingly retreated into a fantasy world of miracle weapons and imaginary victories. The road from Stalingrad led directly to the bunker in Berlin, and Hitler took that first fateful step on January 31st, 1943. The silence in the Wolf's Lair in the days following Stalingrad's fall was more terrifying than any of Hitler's famous rages. Staff officers moved through the corridors like ghosts, speaking in hushed tones. The maps that had once shown glorious advances now told a story of irreversible collapse. Yet what happened next reveals one of the most fascinating psychological patterns in military history. Rather than accept reality, Hitler plunged deeper into denial. His first move was characteristically defiant. Instead of ordering a strategic withdrawal to shorter, more defensible lines, as every competent general recommended, he began planning an even larger offensive. Operation Citadel, the attack on the Kursk salient, was born not from military logic, but from pure psychological need. Hitler needed to prove to himself most of all that Stalingrad had been a fluke. We will show the world that German military power remains unstoppable, he declared during a planning session in March 1943. The preparations for Kursk reveal how detached Hitler had become from reality. He delayed the offensive repeatedly, waiting for new wonder weapons that would guarantee victory. The Panther tank, the Ferdinand tank destroyer, the new Tiger tanks. He became obsessed with technical specifications while ignoring the strategic picture. Meanwhile, the Soviets used the delay to build the most elaborate defensive network in military history. They dug 3,000 m of trenches, laid over 1 million mines, and concentrated nearly 20,000 artillery pieces. They knew exactly where the Germans would attack thanks to intelligence from British codrears and their own spy network. When the battle finally began on July 5, 1943, it was less a military engagement than a slaughter. German tanks advanced into carefully prepared killing zones. The new Panther tanks, which Hitler had praised as invincible, broke down with mechanical problems before even reaching the front lines. The Ferdinand tank destroyers lacking machine guns were swarmed by Soviet infantry, who climbed onto them and destroyed them with grenades. At Prokhorovka, what was later called the largest tank battle in history, became a chaotic melee where Soviet T-34s charged German formations at point-blank range, accepting horrific losses to stop the advance. The aftermath of Kursk broke something fundamental in Hitler's command style. His chief of operations, General Husinger, noted after Kursk, he no longer listened to professional advice. He became convinced that everyone was either incompetent or treasonous. This paranoia manifested in physical symptoms documented by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Mororel. Hitler's daily drug regimen expanded dramatically, stimulants to get through the day, sedatives to sleep at night, various injections for mysterious ailments. His hands developed a persistent tremor that he tried to hide by always keeping one hand gripping a table or holding a document. But the true turning point in Hitler's psychological collapse came on July 20th, 1944, when Colonel Klaus von Stahlenberg's bomb exploded in the conference room. It did more than damage Hitler's body. It shattered his last remaining connections to reality. The man who emerged from the rubble was a caricature of his former self. His trousers were shredded, his hair singed, his eardrums permanently damaged. But the psychological wounds ran deeper. "Now I know," he screamed at his doctors. "Now I understand why all my plans have failed. It's treason. Treason from the beginning." The purge that followed was medieval in its savagery. Thousands were executed, many on the flimsiest evidence. The German High Command became a place of terror where officers feared to report bad news. Field Marshal von Witzlin was hanged with piano wire. RML was forced to commit suicide. General Frum, who had tried to cover his own involvement by executing Stahlenberg immediately, was himself executed months later. The message was clear. Doubt equaled treason, and treason meant death. In this atmosphere of terror, Hitler's military decisions became increasingly divorced from reality. He issued his fortress cities order, declaring that certain cities must be held to the last man. When commanders pointed out that these cities had no military value, he accused them of cowardice. He became obsessed with minor details: the exact number of tanks in a particular unit, the precise caliber of artillery, while ignoring the collapse of entire army groups. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, was the ultimate expression of this delusion. Every sane military mind knew Germany lacked the fuel, the air cover, and the fresh troops for such an ambitious operation. But Hitler, living in a fantasy world where the laws of logistics no longer applied, believed he could recreate his 1940 triumph. He personally planned the attack down to battalion level, ignoring his general's warnings. When the offensive inevitably failed, he blamed everyone but himself. The weather, the generals, even the soldiers themselves. By January 1945, the disconnect was complete. Hitler was moving armies that existed only on paper, while real soldiers died by the thousands. He spoke of miracle weapons that would turn the tide, even as Soviet artillery shells began falling on Berlin. The clear-throat man who had realized the war was lost at Stalingrad had spent 2 years building an elaborate fantasy to avoid admitting it, and that fantasy was about to come crashing down in a concrete bunker beneath his capital. The descent into the Führer bunker in January 1945 was both literal and symbolic. 50 ft beneath the Chancellor Garden in a cramped, damp, artificially lit world. The final act of Hitler's tragedy would play out. The bunker itself was a masterpiece of engineering and a monument to madness. Reinforced concrete walls, independent oxygen supply, elaborate communication systems, all designed to protect a man who was no longer capable of rational thought. The daily routine in the bunker became a surreal ritual, disconnected from the war raging above. Hitler would emerge from his private quarters around noon. His uniform often stained, his body stooped, the famous mustache sometimes ungroomed. The situation conferences, once crisp military briefings, had become theater of the absurd. General Wilhelm Bergdorf, who replaced the more realistic General Guderian, would present wildly optimistic reports of armies that had ceased to exist. General Wank's 12th Army is preparing to relieve Berlin, he would claim, while Wenck's actual forces were being annihilated 50 miles away. The breaking point came on April 22, 1945. During the afternoon situation conference, Hitler was finally told the truth he had been avoiding for years. General Karl Koller, risking his life, reported that General Steiner's attack, the operation Hitler had been counting on to save Berlin, had never happened. The troops didn't exist. The plan was pure fantasy. What followed was the most dramatic psychological collapse ever witnessed by the German leadership. Hitler flew into a screaming rage, his face turning purple, spittle flying from his lips. "Everyone has betrayed me," he shrieked. "No one has told me the truth. The armed forces have lied to me." Then, just as suddenly, he collapsed into his chair, his body going limp in a quiet, broken voice that terrified everyone in the room more than his rage ever had. He said, "The war is lost." He announced he would stay in Berlin and die. The shock in the bunker was absolute. For 12 years he had preached willpower and defiance. Now he was admitting defeat. The unraveling that followed was both rapid and grotesque. First came the settling of scores when Hermann Göring, thinking Hitler had effectively abdicated, sent a telegram offering to take over leadership of the Reich. Hitler ordered his arrest for treason. When he learned that Heinrich Himmler was attempting to negotiate surrender through Swedish intermediaries, he ordered his former most loyal follower executed. "Nothing will be left to them," he screamed. Nothing, they will inherit only ruins. The marriage to Ava Braun that night was a scene from a grotesque play. The bride wore a black dress, the witnesses were drunk, and the ceremony took place in the map room while Soviet shells exploded overhead. Hitler, who had always kept Braun hidden from public view, now seemed to want some semblance of normalcy in his final hours. Yet even this was tainted by his narcissism. During the wedding supper, he spent most of the time lecturing the small gathering about how the German people had failed him, how they deserved their fate for not being strong enough. The dictation of his political testament was the final act of self-delusion. For hours he paced his study, pouring out his bitterness onto paper. He blamed everyone but himself. Jews, the Bolsheviks, international capitalism, even the German people who had proven themselves weak. The document was a masterpiece of self-pity, completely divorced from the reality that he and he alone had led Germany to destruction. He clears throat, appointed Grand Admiral Dönitz as his successor with the absurd instruction to continue the fight, knowing full well that continued fighting meant more meaningless death. The final 24 hours were an exercise in surrealism. While Hitler prepared for suicide, his staff engaged in bizarre rituals of normalcy. His vegetarian cook continued preparing meals that went uneaten. His clears throat secretaries typed documents that would never be read. His guards stood at attention in corridors that led nowhere. The outside world had ceased to exist. All that remained was the bunker and its collective madness. On April 30th, 1945, at about 3:30 p.m., the end came. Hitler and his new wife retreated to his private sitting room. The method of suicide, cyanide, and a gunshot was characteristic of the man, over-engineered and dramatic to the end. When his valet, Heinz's Linger, entered the room minutes later, he found Hitler slumped on sofa, blood dripping from a gunshot wound to his temple, the smell of bitter almonds filling the air. Ava Braun lay beside him, dead from cyanide, her face contorted in agony. The disposal of bodies was as chaotic as everything else in the bunker. With Soviet shells exploding in the Chancellor Garden, Hitler's SS guards carried the corpses up the emergency exit, doused them in gasoline, and attempted to burn them, but the fire was inadequate, the gasoline scarce, and the bodies only partially consumed. When Soviet troops found the remains the next day, they were barely recognizable. The tragic irony of Hitler's end is that he had known the war was lost since that January day in 1943, when Powys surrendered at Stalingrad. Everything that followed, Kursk, the Atlantic Wall, the Ardennes offensive, had been an elaborate exercise in avoiding that reality. His realization didn't come in a single moment, but in a slow, painful drip of disappointments and betrayals, until the cumulative weight became unbearable. The man who believed will could conquer all ultimately discovered that some realities cannot be wished away. The flames that consumed his body in that Chancellor Garden were the same flames consuming the Reich he had built, and the same flames that had been burning in his soul since the day he first understood that his 1,000-year Reich would not last a dozen